You know, I look at this sheet up here, and you probably looked at that and looked at the title on your page, and I wonder, that was the title of an article I saw in a religious article, and I say religious in the sense of a worldly religion article. But can you figure out what that was? How many of you have figured it out? Raise your hand. Justin did. Avery says she has no idea, but she's certain that she has no idea. If you look at that, it means questions, that's the question mark, are greater, that's that little sign like that. Whatever is on the open side is greater. It's a mathematical term. And then greater than certainty. That's a period. And that's a common thought. You know that in religion, questions are a problem. It's a serious problem. And it's plagued mankind since the beginning of time. Whenever the devil approached Adam and Eve was by the tree. He said, eat this. She said, God said in the day that we eat it, we're going to die. And he in essence said, no, that's not really true. It's better to question things than to be absolute like you are. You don't know that's true. And then he even gave an alternative, that God just doesn't want you to enjoy things the way that he does and have what he has. Moses, in Exodus 3 and 4, was told repeatedly to go back to the land. And he repeatedly told God, I'm not sure about that. I have to question that. What you're saying, it doesn't make sense to me. What you're saying just doesn't seem to fit my lifestyle, doesn't seem to fit who I am. What he was saying is, questions are greater than certainty. The people, including Moses in Numbers 11th chapter, they got to the point the people started complaining and said, we remember what we had. We remember the cucumbers. We remember all the things that we had back in Egypt. We don't have that here. And so they began to question, and Moses was right in there with them. God, why is it that we don't have this? Moses said, if I made a mistake in bringing them to this point. And in essence, what they were saying is, questioning God and his ability to provide, that it was sufficient, questioning that is better than certainty. God, are you sure about this even? And then in Numbers 12, Miriam and Aaron, they looked at Moses and said, do you take too much upon you? Has God spoken only by you? Well, the truth was, yes, he had. That was what God said. But they thought it was unfair. And they thought it was better to question what plan God had set forth than to put forth a certainty of that. You look over in the New Testament and you find it in many instances, but really the one that just strikes out. In the book of Matthew, the 22nd chapter, you find Pilate is confronting Jesus. And in the discussion, a question was asked by Pilate. What is truth? In other words, that was kind of a rhetorical question on his part because he thought that truth really had no basis. He was saying, questioning is greater than being absolute, being dogmatic. You look at it and you think about those things and you think, well, is that a problem we have today? You look and say, well, Jack, why are you preaching on this anyway? What does that have to do with us? Well, the reality is I preach on this and I look and I try and hit this aspect of things on a regular basis because it is such a problem. Think about the things that you hear. We're all going the same place, just different ways. In other words, there is no certainty on which way we go through this life. It's better to just question it and find what conforms to myself, what makes me feel good, how it is that this gives me comfort. Well, we're just going to have to disagree about that. We're going to have to agree to disagree. You know what that's saying? Now, you and I, we can discuss things and everything, but there's no way to come to an absolute. You got your truth, I got mine. We're just going to have to agree to disagree. And after all, everyone's got the right to their own belief, don't they? In other words, belief or faith has no point in certainty. What is your belief, your faith, may be yours, but mine is different. Gospel, doctrine, that was something that years ago plagued the church. It resulted in, you look, and in essence, you can go to a congregation of your choice in the sense that you find whatever comfort level you want. It's like a pendulum that swings back and forth. Well, they all came from this concept out throughout this area. The idea that we unite on gospel. The gospel is the important thing. But we agree to disagree on doctrine. Well, if you just study the words gospel and doctrine, you find a big problem there. But that was set forth and still is set forth in various ways. Several years back, it was big F and little f fellowship. We have a strong fellowship. In other words, we be brethren based upon certain core matters. But there are other matters that we just agree to disagree. That's the little f fellowship. I'm not really in a strong fellowship with you, but we still get along. Now you look at those, gospel and doctrine, one of the basic problems is what's included in either the gospel or in big F fellowship, that changes as time goes on. Because after all, it's better to question it anyway. So there is no objective standard. And then justification, sanctification, that's another flavor of this. We receive justification whenever we obey the gospel. And then sanctification is a process of questioning and going through as we look at those things that we can't be certain about. Well, you see that, and that deals with the idea, and this is a phrase that was very common years ago, unity and diversity. You don't hear the phrase a lot, but this morning I turned on the television, and I was sitting there thinking, Jack, why do you do this to yourself? I turn and I flip through and I see all the different religious programs. And I thought, one thing it does for me, number one, it gets my heart going. To hear the things that are said and done. But it also makes me realize that this concept is very much alive. You can go, I can watch this preacher, and, that's so good, I really enjoy that. And then I go over, I watch, that's so good. In other words, we can just all agree. We can have unity. We're diverse. This one is a member of this group, this is a member of that group. And that's why we hear about Baptist doctrine, Methodist doctrine, Church of Christ doctrine, like they're all on equal footing. It's just what the different groups, as they're going to the same place, just different ways, it's all what they believe. But it's true for them. What's true for the Baptist, I grew up as a Baptist, what's true for them isn't true for the Methodist, and what's true for them isn't true for the Church of Christers. All of these phrases, they just tell us that there is more to this idea of questioning is greater than certainty or dogmatism than what we would like to admit. It is a very real problem. You look and you find what we need to do is, what does God say? Think about some specifics. And we could go on and on. This could be a very long lesson if we looked at all the things in this world that people agree to disagree on. But just think of a few of them. We all have the right to our own belief. Was that ever attempted in the Scriptures? In the book of 1 Corinthians, the first chapter, in verse 10 through 13, the Apostle Paul wrote, and it's notable that the first problem he addressed at the Corinthian church was this lack of unity. And that spawned all sorts of problems as you go on, because it downplayed the idea of any certainty. There were some saying, I have Apollos, I have Cephas, I'm Christ. Now, that last one's right. But he said, as he went on and he addressed the problem, then he said, the reason I'm doing this is I've heard there are divisions among you. And he asked the question, is Christ divided? No. And he even went to a certainty that they knew about. He asked, who was crucified for you? Was Cephas? I mean, in essence, he was saying, think of all these doctrines you're following. Were they crucified for you? Were you baptized in their name? You see, there are two certainties that things are based on. Actually, three. Christ is not divided. He was crucified for you. And if you are of somebody, it's Christ. Should be, because you were baptized in his name. So you look at that, and he said, here's the way to get over it. He said, I want you to speak the same things, be of the same mind, be of the same judgment. In other words, better to question everything? He says, no. You have the ability to speak the same things. You have the ability to be of the same mind. You have the ability to be of the same judgment. So this idea, we all got the right to our own belief, well, that's true. Throughout the Scriptures, it's pointed out, you've got the right to your own belief if you want to. You can go down the Broadway. You can believe that's fun, that's good, that's where I want to go. But it's going to lead to destruction. But as far as an acceptable belief, God says no. You don't have that right. What about sometimes you just have to go along to get along? In this world there's so much turmoil, so much struggle. I'm not going to be dogmatic. Because all it's going to do is cause problems. It's going to cause problems for me. It's going to cause problems for others. In the book of Acts, the 4th chapter, the apostles, this is one occurrence in which they were in prison. They were taken and they were beaten and they were told, don't speak any more in this name. They could have gone on and said, look, this dogmatism, this being certain, I know, all it's doing, because it got us killed, didn't it? You know what their response was? We cannot help but speak the things we have seen and heard. That tells you, first of all, they knew. It wasn't, well, we got to question all of this, and really there's no right that we have to say that we absolutely know. No, they said, we're going to speak it. We've seen it, we've heard it. This idea, sometimes you just got to get along because you don't know. God didn't recognize that. Well, that just won't work. There's always, each generation, it seems, faces that thing that, the church has got to change if we're going to go on. And worship is one of those sticking points. They come in, well, where's your piano? Where's your choir? Where's your praise group? Well, you need all those things if you're going to progress. Romans, the 1st chapter and verse 25, you find the result of this. They changed the truth of God into a lie and worship the creature rather than the Creator. You say, oh, that's a total rejection. How do you think they got to that total rejection? Refusing to have God in their knowledge. They assumed, first of all, that they had the right to say, this type of worship won't work. After all, who can really say that singing is all God commanded? My feeble mind says, you got 9 instances in the New Testament in which he says sing. You don't have any that he says play. You don't have any that uses an instrument of music other than the harp. But I don't have the right to change it. I don't have the right to change who is authorized to lead a public assembly. I don't have the right to change the frequency of the Lord's Supper or the elements of the Lord's Supper. I don't have the right to change when a giving of your means in a free will fashion is performed on the first day of the week. On and on I go. I can't change who I pray to. All those things. But people today, they change it all. God says you're taking the truth of God and turning it into a lie. You're worshiping and serving the creature rather than the Creator. And then people in society, you can look at any number of things. But today, God's marriage plan, it's so hard to understand. And it's not suitable for today's society. We've changed. We need to grow. We need to evolve. In Matthew 19, you find that question was dealt with. There were those who tempted Jesus, and they said, okay, here's what some people say, and here's what others say, and they took two of the great Jewish leaders that everybody knew of, and after all, it's better to question than to be dogmatic. And they wanted him to say, okay, you be dogmatic. And Jesus simply looked, and he said, have you not read? That in the beginning he made them male and female, and he said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, shall cleave to his wife, and twain shall be one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. Pretty dogmatic, don't you think? One man, one woman, for life. That's it. That's God's plan. Sadly, he had to deal with an objection, or rather exception, because mankind is going to look and say, well, I can't resist this, or what. So fornication is dealt with. But God's plan, not hard to understand. You can bring in all of the big names you want. You can bring in, my preacher says, your preacher says, or this is the way it is today. God says, from the very beginning. Hadn't you read? Truth is something that no man can attain to. You're pretty haughty to say that you have absolute truth. I've sat in meetings in which, years ago when I first moved to the area, I got in a lot of trouble. Thankfully, I had an eldership that stood in front of me. You can say beside me, but they were really in front of me. But I sat in discussion with an eldership in Kansas City, over in Overland Park, and they berated me. Said, well, you just think you know. And so I asked them, I said, okay, here's some of the things I say that I know. You tell me which ones are not true. Well, they didn't want to touch top, side, or bottom of that. The reality is, truth can be known. Do I know everything? No. Deuteronomy, the 29th chapter, we find that there are secret things that belong to God. There's some things he hadn't revealed to us. I got a lot of questions I'd love to have answered that aren't revealed in the Bible. And the truth is, I can say, well, when I get to heaven, I'll know. When I get to heaven, I'm really not going to care about those things, to be truthful. But the reality is, the things that pertain to life and godliness, so I can continue in his word. You're my disciples if you continue. I can know those things. I can be certain about them. And the idea that truth is something you're haughty to say you've attained it, you might as well just stand and scream and say, Jesus, you're a liar. That's horrible to even consider that, isn't it? And there are so many ways to heaven. We have to be so accepting. We can't just say, that little thing, you think you and your group are the only ones going to heaven? In the book of John, the 14th chapter, Jesus, comforting his disciples, said, I go to prepare a place for you, that where I am, there you may be also. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I'll come again, that where I am. Thomas looked and he said, we don't know the way. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, the life. No man cometh to the Father but by me. Sounds pretty dogmatic. You want to take it a step further? Hebrews the 5th chapter, verse 9. You see, Christ is the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obey his commandments. Pretty dogmatic. That tells us we can know what he says and we can do it. And if we don't, we're not on that way. We sang a song about the beauties of heaven. It's not mine if I don't go through Jesus the way that he said and obey his will. I mean, it's so simple. You look and say, okay, what does God say about this? And you find that in fact God did give us, just like he said he did, all things that pertain to life and godliness. What an amazing God we're blessed with. Now some people at this point, they say, well, does God condemn the idea of questioning things, including what he has said? No. As a matter of fact, you look and he actually commands it. In Acts 17 and verse 11, these were more noble than those in Thessalonica in that they searched the Scriptures whether these things were so. In other words, if you're going to be noble, you've been listening and saying, that guy up there, he's kind of crazy. Well, you got the right to your belief on that. Well, let me challenge you to be noble. Search the Scriptures whether the things that I've said are true. You see, I profess to be speaking as oracles of God, 1 Peter 4 and verse 11. I profess that I am preaching the Word as commanded in 2 Timothy 4. Check it. Look it up. God said it was noble to do that with the apostles themselves. So you look, but the problem comes, you say, well, you just agreed with what was said at the outset, that questioning is greater than absolute. No, it's got to be with proper motives. You go over to the book of 2 Timothy, and you find there where the apostle deals with this idea of some who think, well, it's just better to question. Just look, you don't want to just... Well, these individuals, they actually decided to be absolute, but only when it helped them. But notice what he said in 2 Timothy, the 3rd chapter, in verse 6, 7. It says, of this sort are they which creep into houses, lead captive silly women laden with sins, led away with diverse lusts, ever learning, never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. You see, God condemned that very idea that, let's just study together. And by the way, have you ever heard of Bible classes that are just an ignorant swapping session? You've got to have, if you're going to lead a discussion in a Bible class, you got to be careful. If you're going to lead a discussion, it's kind of like, lawyers are taught, if you're going to ask a question of somebody on a stand, you never ask a question that you don't already know the answer to. Well, in discussion in class, you'd best be prepared. Because otherwise, it becomes, well, I think this passage says, and then Jack stands up and says, well, I think it says, and then Jim's going to stand up and say, well, I think it says, and everybody's going to say, oh, that's such a good class. What truth did you come to? Nothing. Ever learning. Never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. And by the way, that condemnation wouldn't be in there if you could not come to a knowledge of the truth. But the reality is we can, as we've already seen. And we've got to have proper motives. Whenever Jesus discussed the idea of those who were tormenting him, testing him, tempting him, trying him, notice in chapter 16 and verse 14, it says, the Pharisees also, who are covetous, heard these things, and they derided him. Well, Jesus' teaching didn't coincide with what they believed and taught. And he said, ye are they which justify yourselves before men. God knoweth your hearts, for that which is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God. In other words, why are you even doing this? If I question, I can look and say, okay, well, John 14 and verse 6, Jesus says, the way, the truth, the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by him. Well, let me say, I've got to question that. I'm going to find some out, because that's not what I teach. What is my search for? Not to find the truth of God, but to justify myself before men. I listened to a man last night. I just flipped through a channel, and maybe it's just like they all run together. But a guy teaching soul sleep. He didn't look, he didn't search. That was just a comforting doctrine. And that is, whenever you die, you're just dead. Jehovah's Witnesses, you're just dead. You're unconscious. Sadly, there are a lot of people that teach that, but the Bible doesn't teach it. But he wanted to justify his teaching, so he just found a passage that seemed to support that. Well, what's my motive? God wants me to look. But in Acts 17, he says, don't look to justify yourselves. You look to see whether it's true. Because it's the truth that makes us free. Well, what's at stake? You know, if I do this, if I accept that, and I disregard the idea of absolutes, you can't be certain, nobody can know, everybody's got their ideas, their own truth. What's at stake? In Romans 15 and verse 4, the things that were written aforetime were written for our learning. The Corinthian writer in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 1, on down through verse 12, he says, these were written so that you don't do that, so that you don't lust after things that they lusted. In other words, don't fall in the same trap. Well, you go back and you find God records those who tried to live by this foolishness. There was anarchy, there was destruction, there was degradation, there was destruction of family, destruction of God's people. Yeah, we're missing out on a lot in not being open-minded, aren't we? We know and act upon essential truth. And it brings us certain things. Whenever I say, yeah, I know. It sets me apart to God. Sanctify them in truth. Thy word is truth. Sanctify, I'm trying to say sanctify and set apart at once. Sanctify, set apart to God's purpose. I can't be that. I can't be used by God without an absolute truth that I can study, see, and know. Free from sin? Wonderful thing, isn't it? Wages of sin is death. But you know, I can be free from that if I believe in absolutes. You know the truth. The truth should make you free. What about worshiping God as He commands? God is spirit. They that worship Him must worship Him in truth. Oh, well, sincerity is all that's needed. No, sincerity has to be there, but it has to be guided by truth. In other words, I have to come to an absolute. What about rejoicing? You know, 1 Corinthians 13, we find the beautiful description of love. The word charity is used. It's from a word agape, the Greek word. Probably everybody's heard that. But that love is described in such wonderful terms. But one of the things it said, it rejoiceth not in iniquity, but it rejoiceth in the truth. You know, you can have a false rejoicing. Well, I'm happy the way I am. I don't need God. I'm fine the way I am. Well, you rejoice in that, but it's going to be short-lived. It's not true rejoicing. True rejoicing comes with truth. And then you look in Ephesians, the 6th chapter, beginning in verse 13, put on the whole armor of God, you might be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. You know, the very first one is have your girds loined. Back up and say it again. Your loins gird about with the truth. You start with truth. And every aspect of that armor after that deals with that truth. The gospel. So I look and I realize that in all of that, it's really summed up. I can have the hope of the gospel. That's found from truth that I know. I encourage you, here's an exercise you can do. If you've got a Bible concordance on your computer, you have the ability to search for a phrase. If you don't know how to do that, get with me, I'll show you how. Go to the New Testament and look up, we know. Go to the New Testament and look up, I know. In other words, certainty. And you look at all of the things. We know that all things work together for good. We know in 1 Corinthians 15 that we'll be raised. We know that God hears our prayers. We know we shall be like Him. What a glorious hope. But if there's no absolutes, I don't know any of that. I'm a miserable, miserable person. You look at it and you remember, question mark, whatever that sign is called, period. Questions are greater than absolute. That's false, that's foolish, it's illogical, it's a lie. What do we find that God does say? Does he say that? No. What he does say is that right there. And you think about that. What does that mean? Question mark equals certainty. You see, God tells me to question, but he says if you do it with the proper means, if you look, you use the right method, the right goal, not just an elusive endeavor, well, we're just all searching for the truth. That's like the hogwash whenever I was a young man and people went out. What are you doing? You quit your job, you're going out to San Francisco, you're doing this, you're smoking pot, you're dressing crazy. I'm trying to find myself. My dad would have slapped me silly, and rightly so. Proper motive, not an elusive endeavor, but realizing that God says truth can be found. So it equals an absolute to those things that God has revealed. Questioning is a growth process if we honestly seek truth in the questions. If you're doing it for another way, you got problems, I got problems. But another question, what am I going to do with that? You know, you might think, well, you had a text at the beginning of the lesson. Well, it wasn't read. Let me read it to you now. John, the 3rd chapter, and verse 16, we're all familiar with that passage where God talks about the great gift of salvation that's available. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. A lot of people stop there. Why not question a little bit and say, what are you talking about? Well, you could go before that, but let's continue after. For God sent not his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. He that believeth on him is not condemned, but he that believeth not is condemned already, because he hath not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. This is the condemnation. Light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. Everyone that doeth evil hateth the light, neither cometh to light, lest his deeds should be reproved. But he that doeth truth, God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Means I don't have to do anything, right? Jesus didn't understand that. He said, he that doeth truth comes to the light, that his deeds may be manifest, that they're wrought in God. You see, I can search for truth, say, I really want to know what the Bible says. But what am I going to do with it when I find it? And the reality is, if I don't act upon that truth, I'm lost. Because coming to the light, remember John 14, verse 6? I am the way, the truth, the life. You do truth, Hebrews 5, verse 9, obey him. Pretty simple, isn't it? No, that idea of, questioning is greater than absolute. There's a term we use in Texas called hogwash. Not true, it's a lie. Destructive. It actually answers to the itching ears of many in the religious world that's warned about in 2 Timothy 4. And